You know how most species think humanity's just a bunch of peaceful diplomats? Well, the Vorak hegemony made that exact mistake. They wiped out 3 colonies, killed over 1 million people, and called us weak. Then Captain Blake contacted them from a civilian transport with a message that changed everything. You just awakened the dragons. What followed wasn't just a battle. It was a galactic recalibration. You know that feeling when a predator thinks it's top of the food chain? The Vorak hegemony practically wrote the manual on it. 7-foot insectoids with mandibles that could crack ship armor. They moved through human space like it was an open buffet. 3 colonies, New Brisbane, Haven's Rest, Fort Meridian, fell in rapid succession. No negotiations, no warning shots, just overwhelming, brutal efficiency. Casualty estimates hit 1.2 million before the Vorak even bothered to slow down. Fleet Commander Zakthul sat on the bridge of the inevitable conquest, like he was lounging in a command throne. He watched the casualty reports scroll by without a flicker of concern. Humans to him were soft, weak, pathetic even. He couldn't wrap his tactical mind around how a species he considered so feeble had managed to spread across 17 systems. In his official log entries, which we later recovered by the way, he kept circling back to the same question. How had a race this fragile expanded so far? He concluded it must have been luck. Or maybe someone else's leftovers. Their military doctrine was textbook shock and awe. No clever flanking maneuvers, no guerrilla tactics. Just hit hard, hit fast, and leave nothing standing. They didn't even scan for secondary defenses. Why bother? In their minds, if the visible fleet was this easy to crush, there couldn't possibly be anything else waiting in the shadows. Arrogance on that scale isn't just confidence, it's a blind spot. Zakthul's personal logs are almost funny in hindsight. He recorded daily updates marveling at human incompetence. Our evacuation procedures puzzled him. Our civilian communication networks offended his sense of order. He saw our colonies not as settlements but as poorly defended resource nodes. Pest control. That's the phrase that kept coming up in his command briefings. They weren't fighting a war. They were exterminating what they considered vermin. What they didn't realize, what their sensors never picked up, what their intelligence never suggested, was that they were only scratching the surface. They saw the garden, but they never wondered what might be growing beneath the soil. They mistook patience for passivity, restraint for weakness, and in doing so they gave us exactly what we needed. A clear, unambiguous reason to respond. Not with the fleet they expected, but with the one they never saw coming. Ever notice how silence can be louder than screaming? Back at Luna Base, Admiral David Cross wasn't running around yelling or demanding reports. He was just sitting there, watching 3 little lights on the strategic map. New Brisbane, Haven's Rest, Fort Meridian. Their steady glow meant everything was normal, or at least not catastrophic. Then one of them vanished. No distress call, no explosion pattern on the long-range scopes, no debris cloud expanding where a colony used to be. It just went dark, like someone flipped a switch. A minute later, the second one disappeared. Then the third. 3 colonies, 3 beacons, gone in under 5 minutes. You don't need to be a tactical genius to know that's not how colonies die. Not normally, anyway. Cross wasn't some paper-pushing bureaucrat who got promoted because he knew the right people. This was a guy who'd fought in 3 separate frontier wars before most of us were even born. He'd seen pirates, rebels, even a couple of first contact scenarios that didn't go well. He knew what it looked like when a colony fell to orbital bombardment, or when a reactor went critical, or when civil unrest took out the comms grid. This wasn't any of those things. This was different. He didn't waste time on panic. He called in his analysis team and started pulling data from every listening post within 50 light-years of those colonies. They weren't looking for who did it, not yet. They were looking at how it was done. Energy signatures, attack vectors, comms interference patterns. The kind of forensic work that tells you more about your enemy than any prisoner interrogation ever could. What they found was clean. Almost disturbingly so. The attacks were surgical, precise, and left no traces behind. No radiation spikes, no residual drive signatures. Not even the usual debris you'd expect from a fleet engagement. It was like the colonies were just erased from existence. The Vorak thought they were being stealthy. They'd use some kind of new jamming tech to block outgoing transmissions and mask their approach. But human listening posts are a lot more sensitive than they realized. We caught the ripple effects, the subtle distortions in subspace, the minute energy fluctuations, the ghost signals that their jammers couldn't quite suppress. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Cross looked at the data, looked at the empty spaces on his map where 3 colonies used to be, and made the connection. This wasn't a raid. This wasn't even a standard military operation. This was a systematic, coordinated attack designed to remove human presence from entire sectors without leaving evidence. The kind of move you make when you're not just testing defenses, you're trying to rewrite the map. He didn't say much, just nodded to his comms officer and sent a priority 1 message through channels so secure even most admirals didn't know they existed. The message was short, encrypted, and only went to one place. Time to wake the dragons. You know what's scarier than a threat? A polite warning. That's exactly what the Vorak hegemony got when Captain Ryan Blake opened a channel from his unarmed diplomatic transport. No escorts, no weapons signatures, just a single civilian-class vessel drifting well outside effective weapons range. When Zachthol's comms officer patched it through to the main screen, they expected to see some panicked official begging for mercy or demanding terms. Instead, they got Blake sitting calmly at his console, looking like he was about to order a coffee. He didn't wait for the Vorak to speak first. Just smiled pleasantly and asked if he could deliver a brief message without interruption. Said it would only take a moment of their time. The sheer normality of it threw them off completely. Here was a human whose colonies they'd just vaporized, acting like he was scheduling a meeting room reservation. Zachthol actually glanced at his tactical display again, probably wondering if they'd missed a hidden fleet hiding behind the transport. Blake's tone never changed from that easy, almost conversational delivery. He started by congratulating them on their recent victories. Called them truly impressive with the same tone you'd use to compliment someone's garden. Not a trace of sarcasm, no hidden anger, just straightforward professional acknowledgement. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make demands, didn't issue ultimatums. The Vorak bridge crew were visibly confused. Their tactical systems kept scanning the area looking for the trap, the ambush, the hidden meaning. They'd never seen diplomacy used as an actual weapon before. For a species that communicates through dominance displays and threat postures, this calm professionalism was completely incomprehensible. Their military doctrine had protocols for surrender negotiations, for defiance, for desperate last stands. It had nothing for polite small talk from someone who should be either furious or terrified. Blake maintained that slightly cheerful demeanor throughout, like he was discussing orbital trade routes rather than the obliteration of 3 colonies. Then he delivered the line. Just 1 sentence, delivered with the same casual tone as everything else. You just awakened the dragons. No emphasis, no dramatic pause, no change in facial expression. Then he signed off with a standard diplomatic closing protocol and severed the connection. The screen went back to showing the starfield, with that lone transport already turning away. This new reality led to a sudden and rather desperate rush to join the Terran Mutual Defense Treaty. 12 different species formally applied for membership, something that would have been unthinkable a year before. They weren't applying because they loved humanity. They were applying because they'd seen the alternative to being under our protection. It was the ultimate insurance policy in a suddenly very dangerous neighborhood. Even the Andromedans, who are usually so aloof they make black holes seem sociable, sent a delegation to Luna Base. They didn't call it a military summit, of course. They requested cultural exchanges and hinted at mutual security arrangements. Their envoys were uncharacteristically cordial, almost deferential. It was a clear signal. If the Andromedans were adjusting their stance, everyone else needed to pay attention. Humanity, to its credit, didn't gloat. There were no victory parades, no boastful speeches. The response was just more diplomacy, more trade talks, more invitations to joint training exercises. The message was consistent. We are not conquerors. We are partners. But now everyone knew that partnership came with a very sharp, very real edge. The exercises themselves changed. They were no longer just about interoperability. They were about demonstrating a shared commitment to a new standard of order. Peace, it turned out, wasn't the absence of conflict. It was the presence of credible consequences. It was the certain knowledge that certain actions would bring a specific, overwhelming, and unavoidable response. The galaxy didn't become a utopia. There were still arguments, tensions, and disagreements. But the threshold for violence had been raised significantly. Nobody wanted to be the next species to learn that lesson the hard way. What follows is the weirdest part. Former enemies becoming allies. Ever seen a pit bull and a kitten share a bed? Stranger things have happened. A year after New Brisbane, you had Vorak warships flying in perfect formation with human destroyers, not as prisoners or trophies, but as active participants in joint training exercises. Their ambassadors showed up at Luna Base with a case of their finest ceremonial wine, calling it a gesture of respectful regret. It wasn't an apology exactly, more like a formal acknowledgement that they'd misread the situation and were now correcting their assessment. The maneuvers themselves were something to watch. Vorak shields covering human flanks during simulated attacks, human sensor arrays feeding targeting data to Vorak missile batteries. They ran through scenarios that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Coordinated defense patterns, integrated command structures, even simulated joint retreat protocols. The Vorak brought their signature resilience to the exercises, soaking up simulated damage that would cripple most ships. Humans contributed tactical flexibility and sensor precision that the Vorak had frankly never encountered before. It was a trade of strengths, each side learning from the other's playbook. This wasn't friendship. Let's be clear about that. It was mutual interest with a very sharp edge. Both sides understood exactly what happened when protocols failed. The memory of the Dragon Fleet's demonstration hung over every exercise, unspoken but ever present. Commanders on both sides knew this cooperation wasn't optional. It was necessary. The alternative was too costly to consider. Admiral Voss oversaw the entire operation from the Dragon's Wrath, monitoring the exercises with that calm detachment she was known for. She noted in her log that peaceful and helpless are not synonymous. It became the unofficial motto of the new arrangement. Peace wasn't weakness. It was a choice, and choices could be unmade if circumstances changed. Everyone understood that, especially the Vorak. Their learning curve was steep. Vorak tactical doctrine had always emphasized overwhelming force and rigid formations. They watched human ships use hit-and-run tactics, feigned retreats and sensor deception with something approaching professional admiration. Meanwhile, human engineers studied Vorak shield modulation patterns and damage control procedures. They were surprisingly effective, if a bit brute force in their approach. The exchange went both ways, making both forces more capable than they'd been separately. Zaktul, now serving as a Vorak liaison officer, actually admitted they'd misread humanity's quiet confidence. He said it during a post-exercise debrief, not as an apology but as a tactical assessment. They'd seen our diplomatic corps and scientific missions and assumed that was the whole picture. They never considered that a species could maintain both a peaceful exterior and a razor-sharp military edge simultaneously. It was a cultural blind spot that nearly cost them everything. The respect that developed wasn't warm or personal. It was the kind of respect two skilled professionals might have after realizing they're better off working together than against each other. It was grounded in a very practical understanding of consequences. Respect comes easier when everyone in the room knows there are dragons watching, and they're not particularly patient with repeat offenders. The exercises became regular events, expanding to include other species that had joined the Mutual Defense Treaty. What started as a necessary measure between former enemies evolved into a broader framework for galactic security, ships from a dozen different civilizations training together, sharing tactics, building interoperability. It was the most powerful peacekeeping tool humanity had ever developed, and it worked precisely because everyone knew it wasn't just for show. Which brings us to the next problem. Just when everything was starting to feel stable, just when the galaxy seemed to be settling into this new polite equilibrium, the distress calls started coming in from beyond the galactic edge. You know how fixing one leak often reveals another? Just when the galaxy had settled into its new polite equilibrium, the distress calls started. Not from the frontier sectors or contested borders, but from beyond the galactic rim. Deep space civilian convoys on established trade routes suddenly went silent. When the first fragmentary messages got through, they described vessels unlike anything in our databases. Not Vorak design principles, not Andromedan, not even vaguely recognizable. Just completely alien geometries moving at speeds that defied current propulsion theories. The attacks followed no discernible pattern. No demands, no communication attempts, no recognizable tactical doctrine. They'd emerge from what seemed like empty space, strike with overwhelming force, and vanish before reinforcements could arrive. Their weapons didn't match any known energy signatures. Some readings suggested they were operating on principles we hadn't even theorized yet. The few sensor logs that survived showed energy outputs that made Vorak main batteries look like chemical propellant weapons by comparison. Humanity's deep space listening posts, the same network that had detected the Vorak's initial attacks, started picking up anomalous readings across a dozen sectors. The signatures didn't correlate with any known species or technology. Analysis teams worked around the clock trying to categorize them, but the computers kept flagging the data as theoretically impossible or sensor error. The patterns were too clean, too efficient, too alien. It wasn't just advanced technology. It was technology developed along completely different evolutionary paths. The Dragon fleet went to immediate high alert status. For the first time since its deployment, even Admiral Voss had no intelligence profile to work with. No tactical assessments, no cultural analysis, not even basic physiological data on the potential opponents. Their databases contained nothing on non-local threats. Every simulation, every training scenario, every contingency plan had been built around known galactic powers. This was something else entirely. Surprisingly, the first offer of assistance came from the Vorak. Their ambassador formally volunteered a squadron of their fastest scout ships, crewed by veterans of the initial conflict. It was a shrewd move, both proving their commitment to the new alliance and positioning themselves to gather first-hand intelligence on this new threat. Their ships were specially designed for deep space reconnaissance, capable of operating far beyond normal supply lines. They understood this kind of warfare better than most. Admiral Cross, reviewing the initial reports in his office at Luna Base, found himself considering a disturbing possibility. What if the Dragon fleet hadn't been created primarily for dealing with regional powers like the Vorak? What if its true purpose, the reason for its extreme capabilities and absolute secrecy, was always meant for something beyond current galactic understanding? The precision, the independent operation capability, the overwhelming force projection. It all made sense if you were preparing for an unknown, potentially existential threat rather than known adversaries. The silence on the Vorak bridge was louder than any alarm. Zachthal sat there for a full minute just processing what had happened. His officers looked at each other, unsure whether to be insulted, confused, or concerned. They'd been prepared for rage, for tears, for threats. They got a message that felt like a weather report. The tactical officers kept running scans, certain there had to be more to it. But there wasn't. Just those words hanging in the air. What they didn't understand, what their cultural framework couldn't process, was that they hadn't received a threat. They'd received a statement of fact. Blake hadn't been trying to intimidate them. He was simply informing them of a change in their operational environment. The difference is subtle but important. One is emotional. The other is clinical. The Vorak were still trying to figure out which this was when their long-range sensors started picking up anomalous readings from the edge of the system. Ever heard of a deep black project that actually stays black? Most don't. Budgets leak, contractors talk, somebody's cousin works in logistics and can't keep a secret. The Dragon fleet wasn't most projects. Blake's message wasn't some poetic threat or empty metaphor. It was a precise factual statement. The dragons were real, and they were the best-kept secret humanity had ever managed to hold. This wasn't some division of the Terran Defense Corps you could look up in a public registry. The regular fleets, the ones the Vorak had just steamrolled, were the public face of human military power. The Dragon fleet was the contingency plan for when that public face got punched. It was the answer to a very specific question. What happens if someone mistakes our preference for peace for an inability to wage war? The answer was a fleet built not for patrols or show-the-flag missions, but for one thing only: surgical, overwhelming force. Internal briefings called it technology your science fiction writers haven't imagined. And they weren't exaggerating. This wasn't about building bigger guns or thicker armor. It was a complete paradigm shift in warfare. The ships were designed like apex predators, sleek, efficient, and brutally effective. Every system served a combat function. No diplomatic quarters, no science labs, no spacious crew lounges. They were instruments of pure application, designed to operate independently for years if necessary, striking from the shadows and vanishing before anyone knew what happened. Keeping something that big secret required more than just classified files. It took decades of deliberate misinformation. Budgets were buried under layers of false appropriations, listed as deep space telescope arrays, experimental communication networks, even civilian infrastructure projects. Most admirals in the regular fleet had no clearance to know it existed. Only a handful of people, Admiral Cross among them, knew the full scope and capability of what was sitting in hidden dockyards on the edge of explored space. The Vorak intelligence apparatus, for all its boasting, never got a whisper. Their scouts and spies reported exactly what we wanted them to see. A conventional military focused on defense and deterrence. Their scans of our systems showed primitive energy signatures and obsolete hull compositions. They saw what we showed everyone. They never thought to look for what we weren't showing. The dragons weren't sleeping. That implies inactivity. They were waiting. Training, refining tactics, running simulations against every conceivable threat. They were waiting for a reason. Not a provocation, not a border skirmish, but a clear, unambiguous act that demonstrated a fundamental refusal to coexist. The destruction of 3 colonies and over 1 million lives met that criteria perfectly. The Vorak didn't stumble into a trap. They presented a textbook case for deployment, which brings us to their first real-world test. Not a simulation, not a drill. An actual live-fire exercise against an enemy that had just proven itself capable, ruthless, and utterly confident. The Vorak thought they were about to learn how humans surrender. They were about to learn what happens when you force a reserved hand to finally play its cards. You know how some weapons aren't just tools, they're statements? The Dragon fleet made that point without saying a word. One moment the space around the Vorak armada was empty. The next, 37 ships dropped out of slipstream so smoothly they seemed to phase into existence. No energy surges, no distortion waves, no warning flares. They just appeared. Like ghosts deciding to become solid again. The lead vessel, designated Dragon's Wrath, hung in the void like a predator considering its prey. It wasn't bulky or imposing in the traditional sense. Its lines were sleek, almost elegant, but in the way a sharp blade is elegant, all function and implied violence. You didn't need to be a tactical expert to understand that every curve, every angle served a purpose. It was beautiful the way a live wire is beautiful right before it electrocutes you. On the bridge of the inevitable conquest, sensor panels lit up like festival displays. Energy readings spiked so high the systems initially flagged them as measurement errors. Hull compositions didn't match any known material in the database. Drive signatures showed patterns the computers classified as theoretically impossible. The tactical officer actually reset his console twice, convinced it was malfunctioning. Zachthul didn't hesitate. He saw 37 ships against his several hundred, and assumed it was a desperation move. Maybe a sacrificial rearguard to cover a retreat. He gave the order to engage immediately. No warnings, no demands for surrender. Standard Vorak doctrine, overwhelming force against inferior numbers. Weapons officers targeted the human ships with everything they had. Particle beams that could melt battlecruiser armor flashed across the void. Antimatter torpedoes streaked toward their targets on trails of distorted light. Kinetic projectiles accelerated to near-relativistic speeds. It was the kind of barrage that should have vaporized a small moon. The Dragon fleet didn't evade, didn't activate countermeasures, didn't even change course. Their shields absorbed the attacks without so much as a flicker. Later analysis would describe the energy dissipation as like guiding pebbles. The defenses didn't just block the incoming fire. They neutralized it so completely that there wasn't even residual heat transfer. The Vorak might as well have been throwing rocks at a mountainside. Then the dragons returned fire, not with the chaotic barrage the Vorak expected, but with precise targeted beams of coherent energy. There were no explosions, no debris fields, no secondary detonations. 37 Vorak ships simply ceased to exist. Their energy signatures vanished from tactical displays. Their mass readings dropped to 0. One moment they were there, the next they were empty space. The entire engagement lasted 12 seconds from first shot to last, that was it. No grand announcement, no triumphant transmission. The Dragon fleet just hung there in formation, silent and unmoving. On the Vorak bridges, officers were still checking their instruments, certain there had to be some mistake. But the empty sectors on their tactical plots told the real story. The lesson had begun and the curriculum was suddenly very clear. Ever seen a surgeon use a sledgehammer? Neither have I. Precision matters. Admiral Helena Voss on the Dragon's Wrath understood that better than most. Her target wasn't some random cruiser. It was Zachthul's flagship, the inevitable conquest. And she wasn't aiming to destroy it. That would have been too easy, too messy, too Vorak. Her objective was far more specific. disable it completely while leaving the crew unharmed. Weapons, propulsion, life support, comms, everything that made it a warship had to go. But the people inside stayed alive. It's one thing to obliterate an enemy. It's another to show them exactly how helpless they really are. A single energy beam lanced out from the dragon's wrath. It wasn't the chaotic blast the Vorak expected. This was a tightly focused stream of coherent energy, more powerful than their entire main battery combined. Yet so precise it could have been used for microsurgery. It sliced through their hull like it was parting water. There was no explosion, no fiery decompression, just a clean, silent incision. Inside the inevitable conquest, systems began failing in sequence. Not all at once, not randomly. It was methodical, almost rhythmic. Weapons control went offline first, then propulsion, shields, communications, environmental systems. Life support dropped to minimal emergency levels. It was like watching someone unplug a complex machine one cable at a time. Each system shut down smoothly without so much as a power surge. The Vorak engineers later described it as elegant dismantling. Their damage control teams had nothing to do. There was no damage to control, just absence. On the bridge, the main lights cut out. Emergency lighting flickered on a moment later, casting everything in dim red. Zachthel sat in his command chair, hands gripping the armrests. His displays were dark. His comms panel was dead. He could see his own breath in the suddenly cold air. Around him, officers were checking systems, running diagnostics, trying to understand what had happened. They weren't panicking. They were confused. This wasn't how battles ended. Ships blew up. Crews died. They didn't just stop working. Then Voss's voice came over the emergency channel, the only system she'd left active. No video, just audio. Calm, flat, utterly devoid of emotion. "We are not conquerors," she said. "We are accountants." And then the line went dead again. No elaboration, no threats, no demands. Just those 7 words. Every Vorak on that ship understood in that moment that they were alive because humanity had chosen to let them live. Not because they'd fought well, not because they'd gotten lucky, but because their opponents had exercised restraint. It was a humiliating, sobering realization. They'd come expecting a war of annihilation. What they got was a clinical demonstration of superiority so complete, it didn't even require killing them. This wasn't war in the way the Vorak understood it. It was a calibration, a resetting of expectations. They'd brought brutality. We'd answered with precision. They'd offered indiscriminate destruction. We'd replied with surgical control. The message was clear. We don't fight like you. We don't think like you, and we don't win like you. What follows is the bill coming due. You know how some victories aren't about winning, they're about setting terms? Admiral Voss understood that better than most. She didn't follow up her surgical strike with more violence. She sent a text-based transmission to the disabled Vorak flagship. No video, no voice, just clean, precise text scrolling across their emergency displays. 3 demands. Full financial reparations for all casualties and damages, formal acknowledgement of war crimes before the Galactic Council, and immediate withdrawal from all human-claimed systems. Then she gave them a deadline, 72 hours, not to negotiate. To comply. The key word in her message wasn't reparations or withdrawal, it was obliteration. She didn't say they'd face conquest. Conquest implies you take something, territory, resources, slaves. It's a transaction. Obliteration is different. It means you erase something so completely that there's nothing left to remember. No history, no remnants, no evidence it ever existed. It's the difference between a foreclosure and a forest fire. One changes ownership, the other leaves barren ground. On the Vorak flagship, the command council was stunned. They'd expected demands for territory, subjugation, maybe even ritual humiliation. Their entire culture was built on dominance hierarchies. You win, you take the spoils. You lose, you become the spoils. This was something else entirely. Humanity wasn't asking for anything for itself. It was demanding accountability, justice, a public admission of wrongdoing. For a species that measured worth in strength and possession, this was incomprehensible. It was like losing a duel and being asked to write an essay on ethical combat instead of handing over your sword. They now faced a choice far more difficult than simple surrender. Survival meant admitting they were morally and ethically wrong. Not just outgunned, but objectively incorrect in their actions. For a proud warrior culture, that was a more bitter pill to swallow than defeat. Several commanders argued for a final suicidal charge. Better to die with honor than live in shame. But Zachthul, staring at the cold text on his screen, recognized the deeper message. This wasn't about shame, it was about precedent. Voss's final line drove it home. Your civilization continues if you choose correctly. Not you win, not you survive, but your civilization continues. She was speaking on a historical scale, not a tactical one. The power on display wasn't just in the weapons that could dismantle a ship without killing its crew. It was in the calm authority to define the terms of existence afterward. They weren't being offered a treaty. They were being offered a lesson. Power isn't just about who has the biggest guns. It's about who gets to write the rules after the shooting stops. The Vorak thought they were playing a game of capture the flag. Humanity was playing chess with galactic moral codes. One side was thinking about next week's plunder. The other was thinking about the next century's diplomatic landscape. Which brings us to the galaxy's new etiquette lesson. It's one thing to know someone is stronger than you. It's another to realize they're also smarter, more patient, and have a much clearer long-term plan. The Vorak had to decide if their pride was worth the end of everything they'd ever built. It's a calculation most species never have to make. They usually don't get the warning first. Ever wonder why you don't swat a fly when you can teach it to avoid your kitchen? Some human factions certainly wanted to take the swatter to the Vorak hegemony. The hardliners argued for total retaliation, glass their homeworld, sterilize their colonies, and the threat permanently. They had the votes in the assembly too. Public opinion was running hot after the colony attacks. But Cross and Voss vetoed it. Not because they couldn't do it, because they understood something fundamental about power. Obliterating the Vorak would have made humanity just like them. Maybe worse. They killed colonies in what they considered a military action. Wiping out their entire civilization would be genocide. The goal wasn't terror. It was deterrence. A dead enemy can't learn from its mistakes. A dead enemy can't pay reparations. A dead enemy just becomes a martyr for the next generation of fanatics. The living, breathing, thoroughly defeated Vorak hegemony served a much more useful purpose. They became a walking, talking lesson to every other species in the galaxy. Look what happens when you misjudge humanity. Look what happens when you mistake restraint for weakness. The Vorak surrender wasn't just a military outcome, it was a diplomatic tool. Every ambassador could point to them and say, see, they're still here. They're rebuilding, they're paying their debts, but they're not dominating anyone anymore. It was a case study in consequences. It also let humanity control the narrative perfectly. We're not monsters who exterminate entire species. We're judges who enforce galactic rules. We're the reasonable ones who gave them a choice. However grim that choice might have been, the reparations themselves served dual purposes. Practically, they funded the rebuilding of the destroyed colonies and supported the victims' families. Symbolically, they forced the Vorak to acknowledge the cost of their actions in terms they understood. Resources, credits, material wealth. The internal debates were intense. Cross had to testify before 3 different security committees explaining why we shouldn't use the Dragon Fleet to its full potential. He kept making the same point. Strength isn't measured by how many you can kill. It's measured by how many you choose not to kill. Restraint requires more power than unleashing everything you have. Anyone can press a button and destroy a planet. It takes real strength to disable a fleet without killing its crew, and then offer terms instead of tribute. Voss put it even more bluntly in her after-action report. She said the Vorak would make better allies than corpses. Living, they could provide intelligence, resources, and eventually even military support. Dead, they'd just be a stain on humanity's reputation and a rallying cry for anyone who feared us. The reparations scheme wasn't charity. It was a long-term investment in stability. The Vorak would work for decades to pay off their debt. During that time, they'd be integrated into the galactic economy. They'd have reasons to cooperate instead of conquer. That was it. The message spread faster than any propaganda campaign could have managed. Species that had been quietly encroaching on human space suddenly became very interested in border negotiations. Governments that had been hedging their bets started announcing new trade agreements. Everybody was suddenly very polite, very correct, very attentive to diplomatic protocols. They'd seen what happened to the Vorak. They'd also seen what didn't happen to them. Humanity had power, but it also had principles. That combination turned out to be far more frightening than simple brutality. You know how one loud noise can silence a room? Within 6 months of the Dragon Fleet's intervention, that's essentially what happened across the known galaxy. An ambassador from a neutral system famously described the new political climate as remarkably more polite. It wasn't just talk. The data showed a sharp immediate drop in hostile activity. Piracy rates plummeted by 80% almost overnight. Raids that had been a constant nuisance on the frontier just stopped. It turns out that when pirates know there's a real chance their target might actually be a Dragon-class vessel in disguise, they suddenly find other, safer professions. Frontier disputes that had been simmering for years, the kind that usually ended with orbital bombardments or blockades, started getting resolved at negotiation tables instead. Diplomats became the new frontline soldiers. Species that had been making subtle, aggressive moves toward human space suddenly discovered urgent diplomatic engagements back in their home sectors. They recalled fleets, softened their rhetoric, and started talking about mutual understanding and cultural exchange. It was a stunning turnaround and everyone knew why, but nobody said it out loud. The Dragon Fleet's existence became the galaxy's worst-kept secret that nobody officially acknowledged. Everyone knew. They'd seen the sensor ghosts, heard the rumors, watched the Vorak suddenly become very interested in paying reparations. But you wouldn't find it in any official briefings or public databases. It was the thing discussed in quiet tones behind closed doors. The unspoken understanding that changed every calculation. You didn't need to see the dragon to know it was in the room. The galaxy's newfound peace suddenly seemed incredibly fragile. All the diplomatic agreements, the mutual defense treaties, the joint training exercises, they were built around understanding the rules of engagement. This new threat played by different rules, maybe no rules at all. The careful balance of power humanity had established meant nothing to something that didn't recognize the players or the game. Scout ships from multiple species began probing the areas where attacks had occurred, moving cautiously into the uncharted regions beyond the galactic rim. The joint fleet, once training against hypothetical scenarios, now found itself facing a real unknown. Admiral Voss's standing orders were simple: observe and report. No engagement without positive identification and clear authorization. For a fleet designed to deliver overwhelming force, the restraint was unusual, but necessary. Nobody wanted to start a war with something they didn't understand. The real test wasn't going to be about who had the biggest guns or the best shields. It would be about who could adapt fastest to completely new rules of engagement. The Dragon Fleet had been built to counter every known threat. Now it faced something genuinely unknown. The Vorak conflict had been a calibration. This looked like it might be a final exam. That was it. The real test might just be starting. Ever notice how smart species do dumb things? Zakthul's initial arrogance wasn't some unique character flaw. It was practically standard issue for conquerors. They see diplomacy as weakness, peace as laziness, restraint as cowardice. It's a mindset that's doomed more empires than economic collapse or rebellion. They look at a species that prefers talking to shooting and assume it's because they can't shoot well enough. It never occurs to them that maybe we just don't like cleaning up the mess afterward. Humanity's expansion across 17 systems wasn't luck or accident. It was strategy dressed up as exploration. We let everyone see exactly what we wanted them to see. Traders opening new routes, scientists studying nebulas, diplomats building relationships. The military side of things stayed carefully hidden, because showing your full strength is a great way to start an arms race. Better to seem harmless until someone gives you a reason not to be. It's the oldest play in the book, but it works because conquerors always assume everyone thinks like they do. The Vorak intelligence apparatus fell for it completely. Their reports focused on our soft assets, the civilian infrastructure, the open trade networks, the apparent lack of fortress worlds. They saw the outward signs of a peaceful civilization and concluded there was nothing underneath. They never considered that maybe the peaceful exterior was the result of having something very sharp hidden, just out of sight. Their analysts were so busy looking for visible threats that they missed the one that was deliberately kept invisible. Their assessment of human capabilities was essentially a list of what they could easily observe. Frontier defenses that were adequate for pirates but not for a dedicated fleet. Colonial administration that prioritized quality of life over military readiness. A diplomatic corps that seemed more interested in trade agreements than border disputes. They built their entire tactical plan around this incomplete picture, never questioning why a species that had spread so far would have such apparently weak defenses. The possibility that it might be deliberate never crossed their minds. This kind of misjudgment isn't just about bad intelligence. It's about psychology. When you've spent centuries conquering weaker species, you start assuming that's how the universe works. You're strong, others are weak. The idea that someone might be intentionally hiding their strength doesn't fit the worldview. It's why they dismissed Captain Blake's initial contact as some kind of desperation move rather than what it actually was. A final warning from someone who knew exactly how the coming engagement would play out. Underestimation turns out to be the deadliest weapon humanity never had to fire. We didn't develop it, we didn't deploy it, we just let our opponents supply it themselves. They looked at what we showed them, filled in the gaps with their own assumptions, and arrived at exactly the wrong conclusion. The Dragon Fleet wasn't just a military asset. It was the payoff for decades of carefully managed perceptions. What follows is how we keep them guessing even now. You know how holding back can be harder than lashing out? Building the Dragon Fleet required more discipline than using it ever would. The financial commitment alone would make your head spin. Trillions of credits diverted through so many shell corporations and false budget lines that even the accountants probably lost track. Decades of funding buried under colony development projects, infrastructure upgrades, scientific research grants, all while politicians argued they should be spending on visible benefits, not hypothetical future wars. Admiral Cross spent half his career testifying before oversight committees, explaining why we needed a backup plan for our backup plan. Maintaining that level of secrecy wasn't just about locked doors and encrypted files. It required active deception on a galactic scale, false flag operations made to look like pirate attacks, disinformation campaigns suggesting failed weapons projects. Even allies were kept completely in the dark, which meant constantly walking that fine line between cooperation and concealment. One slip-up could have sparked a diplomatic incident or worse, an arms race. The entire operation balanced on a knife's edge for years. Then there was the human cost. Not just the money, but the people. Voss's crew trained for years in complete isolation, running simulations and drills without ever knowing if they'd actually be deployed. They mastered technology so advanced the regular fleet didn't even know it existed, all while maintaining the fiction that they were just another Terran Defense Corps division. The psychological toll of that kind of preparation, knowing you have this capability but having to sit on your hands during border skirmishes and pirate raids, does something to a person. It takes a special kind of discipline to have a solution to a problem and choose not to apply it immediately. The moral weight rested heaviest on the commanders. Cross and Voss knew exactly what the fleet could do. They watched smaller conflicts escalate, colonies suffer, lives be lost, all while having the means to end those situations decisively. But deploying the Dragons for anything less than an existential threat would have revealed the trump card too early. It would have made the entire decades-long investment worthless, so they waited. They absorbed the political pressure, the public criticism, the internal doubts, all while maintaining that perfect silence. Restraint isn't passive. It's not just not doing something. It's an active, expensive, disciplined choice that requires constant maintenance. The Dragon Fleet wasn't sitting in dock gathering dust. It was constantly being updated, refined, trained. The crews rotated through, maintaining readiness without ever knowing why. The technology evolved beyond what even the Vorak eventually faced, all while everyone involved had to pretend this massive investment of resources and talent was something else entirely. The politicians who argued against the funding weren't wrong, from their perspective. They saw colonies that needed infrastructure, trade routes that needed protection, citizens who wanted better lives. They couldn't see the bigger picture, that sometimes the best defense is the one nobody knows exists. That showing your strength is often the quickest way to make someone test it. The Dragon Fleet worked precisely because nobody believed it was possible until it was too late. Which brings us to why it was worth it, not just because it stopped the Vorak, but because it changed the entire galactic power dynamic without firing a shot until absolutely necessary. The cost wasn't just in credits and resources. It was in patience, discipline, and the willingness to absorb short-term losses for long-term security. Something most species never quite master. Ever seen a knife cut through butter? Now imagine it's a sunbeam through paper. That's the level of technological disparity we're talking about with the Dragon Fleet. This wasn't about building better versions of existing weapons. It was about building things that shouldn't be possible according to current physics models. Their shields didn't just absorb antimatter blasts, they treated them like mild inconveniences. You could hit them with enough firepower to vaporize a planet, and the energy readings wouldn't even flicker. It was the kind of defensive capability that made tacticians question everything they thought they knew about energy dissipation. Targeting systems reached levels of precision that bordered on absurd. They could identify and hit specific compartments on an enemy ship from light years away. Not just the engineering section, but individual components within that section. A power relay here. A weapons control node there. It was surgical strike capability raised to an art form. The Vorak kept looking for the massive energy signatures of traditional weaponry and completely missed the fact that they were being disassembled, piece by piece, with instruments of terrifying accuracy. Propulsion didn't follow any known principles either. They didn't use thrusters or reaction drives. Their ships folded space around themselves, moving in ways that made them completely unpredictable to track. One moment they'd be stationary, the next they'd be somewhere else without any apparent transition. Vorak sensors couldn't get a lock because the ships weren't moving through space in any conventional sense. They were essentially rewriting local physics to suit their navigation needs. Human science fiction writers hadn't even imagined this level of technology. The concepts were so advanced they hadn't appeared in speculative literature, let alone military planning documents. When the first briefings reached certain cleared individuals, the initial reaction was usually disbelief, followed by dawning comprehension of just how much had been kept secret. This wasn't incremental improvement. This was skipping several generations of development entirely. The technology came from two main sources that somehow made perfect sense together. Reverse-engineered alien artifacts provided the theoretical breakthroughs, strange devices and materials recovered from derelict ships and ancient ruins that operated on principles we couldn't explain but could eventually replicate. Combined with pure human research and development grit, the stubborn determination to make something work even when the math said it shouldn't. Teams of scientists and engineers, working in complete isolation for decades, slowly piecing together technologies that would redefine space combat. Superiority in space combat isn't about who has the most ships or the biggest guns. It's about who has capabilities the other side can't match, can't understand, and can't counter. The Dragon fleet didn't win because it outnumbered the Vorak. It won because the Vorak had no frame of reference for what they were facing. Their weapons were designed to counter known threats. Their sensors were calibrated to detect familiar energy signatures. Their tactical doctrines assumed certain physical limitations. The Dragons operated outside all those parameters, that was it. The benchmark for military technology shifted overnight. Every other species in the galaxy suddenly found their fleets obsolete. Not just outdated, completely irrelevant. The rules of engagement had been rewritten by someone who wasn't even using the same rulebook. It wasn't about building better ships anymore. It was about understanding an entirely new paradigm of warfare. What follows is the uncomfortable truth that everyone had to face. You can't compete with something that's playing a different game entirely. The Vorak learned that lesson the hard way. The rest of the galaxy learned it by watching, and everyone suddenly became very interested in whatever humanity was willing to share about these new technologies, or more importantly, what they weren't willing to share. You know how some decisions aren't just tactical, they're ethical. Humanity could have wiped out the Vorak hegemony completely. The Dragon fleet had the capability, the strategic advantage, and let's be honest, the moral justification after 3 destroyed colonies and over 1 million dead. But they didn't. That choice says more about us than any weapon ever could. It wasn't weakness. It was a calculated demonstration that power without principle is just bullying with better technology. The reparation scheme forced the Vorak to confront what they'd done in a way simple destruction never could. Paying for the colonies they destroyed, compensating the families of those they killed, it made the cost tangible. They couldn't just write it off as wartime losses or strategic necessity. Every credit transferred, every resource allocated was a reminder that actions have consequences beyond the immediate tactical outcome. It turned abstract casualties into specific accountability. Acknowledging war crimes before the Galactic Council set a precedent that changed how everyone thinks about conflict. It wasn't enough to just lose the battle. Aggression now came with formal public recognition of wrongdoing. Other species watched the Vorak stand before the assembled ambassadors and admit they'd crossed lines that shouldn't be crossed. That kind of diplomatic humiliation carries more weight than any military defeat. It establishes rules that everyone knows will be enforced. The 72-hour ultimatum gave the Vorak something most conquerors don't offer: agency. However grim the choice, however limited the options, they got to decide their own fate. Obliteration or accountability. It wasn't a take it or leave it surrender. It was a conscious selection between two paths, and the fact that they chose the harder but survivable option said something about their capacity for change. Even in defeat, they maintained some control over their destiny. This moral positioning became incredibly valuable diplomatic currency. When other species saw that humanity wouldn't abuse overwhelming power, that we preferred rehabilitation over retribution, it changed how they interacted with us. They stopped seeing us as just another potential conqueror and started viewing us as potential partners. The reputation for fairness opened doors that military strength alone would have kept closed. It's easier to trust someone who has power but chooses not to misuse it. Admiral Voss's approach demonstrated that true strength isn't just about having the biggest guns. It's about knowing when not to use them. It's about understanding that lasting security comes from stable relationships, not subjugated populations. The Dragon Fleet's capabilities made the initial victory possible, but the restraint shown afterward made that victory meaningful. It transformed a military engagement into a diplomatic lesson. The Vorak learned that humanity judges actions, not species. We didn't punish them for existing. We held them accountable for specific choices. That distinction matters when you're trying to build something more stable than constant warfare. It gives everyone a way forward that doesn't require eternal vigilance or permanent garrisons. They can change their behavior without losing their identity. What follows is how the galaxy internalized this new standard. Suddenly, everyone became very interested in establishing clear rules of engagement, defining acceptable military conduct, and creating frameworks for conflict resolution. The Dragon Fleet's victory didn't just defeat one enemy. It proposed a better way for everyone to coexist. Not through fear alone, but through the understanding that some lines once crossed will have consequences that extend far beyond the battlefield. Ever been to a party where everyone's on their best behavior? That's essentially what the galaxy became after the Dragon Fleet demonstration. Diplomacy stopped being the last resort and became the default opening move. Species that used to rattle sabers now send envoys with carefully worded treaties that have more loopholes than a fishing net. They still want the same things: resources, territory, influence, but they've learned to ask politely first. Piracy dropped to zero in human-controlled space. Not decreased, zero. Raiders who'd been preying on shipping lanes for decades suddenly found other occupations. The calculation was simple. Any patrol ship might actually be a Dragon-class vessel running silent. The risk-reward ratio shifted dramatically when the reward might be instant, undetectable vaporization. Nobody wanted to be the test case. Frontier disputes that would have sparked wars a year earlier now get mediated by Terran arbitrators. Both sides actually show up and present their cases with evidence and historical documents. Nobody tries to bully the process because everyone knows the arbitrators have the Dragon Fleet's comm frequency on speed dial. It's not that humanity threatens to intervene. They don't have to. The possibility does all the work. Trade agreements look different now, too. They include clauses about mutual respect and non-aggression that would have been laughed at before. Signatories actually follow them because the consequences for violation are both certain and severe. The agreements aren't enforced by patrols or inspections. They're enforced by the understanding that cheating might attract attention from parties you really don't want noticing you. The Vorak ambassador became a regular at Luna Base, of all things. He shows up for meetings, shares intelligence on potential threats, and generally acts like a model member of the galactic community. His transformation from conquest-happy commander to cautious diplomat is almost impressive. He understands better than anyone what happens when you misjudge humanity's patience. It's not utopia out here. There are still arguments, tensions, resource shortages, all the usual problems. But the disputes get resolved with paperwork instead of plasma fire. The diplomatic corps handles more traffic than the military these days. The quiet is almost unnerving if you remember what things were like before. Deterrence works best when it's visible but not used. Everyone knows the Dragon Fleet exists. Everyone has heard the stories, seen the sensor ghosts, watched the Vorak transformation. But nobody has seen them deploy since that initial engagement. The uncertainty creates its own kind of pressure. Is that patrol ship just a patrol ship? Is that listening post just a listening post? The not knowing keeps everyone polite. The diplomatic channels hum with activity that would have been unthinkable before. Species that wouldn't even share star charts now exchange cultural attachés. Joint research projects pop up where there used to be border fortifications. The Vorak even offered to help rebuild the colonies they destroyed, an offer that was accepted with careful oversight, but accepted nonetheless. Which brings us to the next generation growing up in this new reality. They'll never know the galaxy as it was, a place where species tested each other constantly, where borders shifted through conquest, where piracy was just part of doing business. They'll inherit a system where the rules are clear, the consequences are certain, and the most powerful force in known space would rather mediate than dominate. It's a quieter galaxy, if not necessarily a gentler one. The peace is maintained not by friendship but by mutually assured courtesy. You know how some stories don't end, they evolve? The Dragon Fleet certainly did. It didn't just remain this mysterious all-human strike force lurking in the shadows. It expanded, started incorporating technology and personnel from allied species. Vorak engineers who used to design weapons to kill us began helping upgrade our shield systems. Their unique understanding of energy dispersion patterns actually improved our defensive capabilities by 18%. Andromedan specialists, usually so private you can't get them to share the time of day, volunteered to refine our long-range sensor arrays. Their tweaks reduced false positive readings by nearly 40%. The training programs open to allied species were something to see. Admiral Voss called them educational opportunities with dragons, which probably sounded better in the briefing room than it did to the species signing up. You'd have Vorak tactical officers sitting next to human engineers, both trying to figure out how to optimize a targeting system they'd been trying to defeat 6 months earlier. The joint exercises became more complex too. Simulated fleet actions, coordinated defense drills, even emergency response scenarios. Everyone brought their unique strengths to the table. The Vorak brought raw durability. The Andromedans brought sensor precision. Humans brought, well, the dragons. The Terran Mutual Defense Treaty suddenly had waiting lists. Species that had been cautiously neutral now lined up to join. They weren't looking for protection from humanity anymore. They wanted protection with humanity. The application process became its own kind of diplomatic theater. Ambassadors showing up with elaborate presentations about their strategic value and cultural compatibility. The vetting process was thorough. You didn't just get in because you asked nicely. You had to demonstrate commitment to the new galactic order. Humanity's reputation completed its shift from peaceful pushovers to fair but formidable other. Species understood that we wouldn't start fights, but they also understood we would finish them. The distinction mattered. It meant they could trust our agreements because we had the power to enforce them, but the restraint to honor them. New colonies started appearing on the frontier again, but this time with Dragon Fleet patrol routes mapped right into their founding charters. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone knew what it meant. Build here and you're under our protection. Don't and you're on your own. The lesson that emerged wasn't what anyone expected. Strength doesn't isolate. It attracts cooperation. Species that would have never considered working together now found common cause in maintaining the stability the Dragon Fleet represented. The shared projects, research initiatives, trade networks, even cultural exchanges, all stemmed from that initial demonstration of power tempered by principle. The dragons didn't just defend existing territory. They built a new framework for galactic relations, one where security wasn't just about weapons but about shared interest and mutual benefit. That was it. The new order established, the lessons learned, the alliances formed. Everyone settled into the new normal, watching the patrol routes and waiting for the next threat to emerge from the darkness. The dragons had reshaped the galaxy without firing a shot in anger since that first engagement. Their presence alone did the work of 1,000 battleships. But out on the edge of known space, beyond the patrol routes and listening posts, something new was stirring. The quiet wouldn't last forever, so the next time someone claims humanity's too peaceful for this galaxy, just remember, we're not weak. We're patient. The dragons don't sleep. They watch. And sometimes that quiet presence is enough to keep everything civil. Want more stories where the universe gets a reality check? Subscribe and hit that bell. Out there, the next misunderstanding is always brewing. Stay curious. Stay vigilant. And maybe think twice before burning down any interstellar villages. You really never know who's listening or what they might be capable of.